So welcome to another Redline live stream, effectively this one going through the second Russo-Georgian War. Not that we suggest that there's any war on the horizon for any friends of mine who are living in Georgia at the moment, but effectively we're going to look at the state of the current Russian army in the Caucasus, the state of the Georgian army, what they can possibly do at the moment, what military equipment they have, what the capabilities are, and how the region would likely react to, a second war in the Caucasus. So, as always, feel free to put your hand up and ask a question. More than happy to take questions as we go through. As always, for the Patreons, this will be recorded. So if you miss this one or you want some, you want the recording of this, feel free to that'll come out in a couple of days, and the presentation can also be available. So let's, I think, first start this conversation kind of talking about the forces, who we have here, what we're looking at, and what these guys have, because it is, effectively going to set the tone for what they have going forward. And I think the first thing to take a look at is going to be geography. Everything it has is effectively shaped by its geography. And as always, I'm going to go now, switch out to my Photoshop. So this is effectively Georgia. Now, let me turn some stuff off so we can get a better look at the geography. Perfect. So effectively, this is Georgia in the white. Down here in red is Turkey. Over here in yellow is Armenia. This is Azerbaijan. This big red bugger is Russia. And obviously this green part here is Abkhazia. Obviously, Georgia would be internationally recognized along those black borders. So this whole area here. But they have these two breakaway states. Both of them are very different from one another. Abkhazia are probably closer to what we'd probably think of as Chechens than what Georgians are. Again, it's debatable who you want to talk to. And effectively, while Abkhazia has always been much more separated than the South Ossetians, the South Ossetians are now completely... It's a very different country as soon as you cross the border. And effectively, the borders have been set by the first 1991, 1992, 1993 wars, because every time the Georgian state effectively gained any ground, the Russians would back the other side. They weren't as powerful as they are now, and we'll go through why. But you can see here, if we kind of take a bit of a squiz around the geography, that Georgia is pretty much... it's between two mountain chains. There's giant mountains in the south, there's mountains in the north, and it's why Georgia is such a unique nation compared to almost anything else, because so many armies through history effectively invaded and took the sort of the south of the Russia here, or they came through the Middle East and they just looked at those Caucasus and went, not worth the effort, let's avoid it. And it is why, for anyone who's been to Georgia or looked at the Georgian language or studied Georgian culture, Georgia is so unique to everything else, mostly because of the fact that they were not just trampled and invaded like so many other cultures were. So it's unique, and it's driven by this fact they are effectively a valley in between two large mountain chains. And those mountain chains are a pain to get over. I mean, we'll go through a bit why, but there's a few bits of infrastructure that really just sort of solidify that. And I think, for anyone who's watched a couple of live streams with me before, I'll tell you my obsession with railways, particularly for Russian war planning. And you can see here in the railway lines that effectively the country is still stuck by this problem of being in between two valleys. You've got most of your kind of infrastructure going on this sort of east to west axis here, with the capital Tbilisi down here, effectively stuck kind of in the middle of the two chains. And that's why Tbilisi is where it is, because effectively it would be, if you were trying to come in from the south here and go to the north, or go to the north to the south, you'd probably cut through Tbilisi at some point. So effectively, you have this country which is, and this is the major problem for any Georgian defense plan, is the fact that if someone takes Gordy or takes some of these middle cities, you cut the country in half, and it is really easy to do so. And they are just a pain to invade. Even today, Turkey is a major trading partner, a significant power in the region, and a significant player. There are only two roads connecting Turkey to Georgia. Russia, there's really, if you take out Abkhazia, the only roads connecting Russia and Georgia are effectively the military road here on the right-hand side. And then there's the road that goes to South Ossetia. And there's only two roads going through the Caucasus because it is just that hard to build. And this is to lay the sort of general problems of what you're up against. But if we turn off railways for a second and take a look at some pipelines, you can effectively see the pipelines all run east to west as well. And that's, Georgia is trying to be a very important crossroads for everyone at the moment. The biggest thing to probably keep in the back of your mind is Georgia is effectively a valley between two giant sets of mountains with quite a low population. So effectively, let's take a brief look. Georgia has about 20,650 soldiers at the moment. Mixed in how good they are, but they're quite well trained and they're quite close to NATO. I would argue that outside of Ukraine, Georgia is probably the closest state relationship-wise to NATO. Georgia per capita was the largest non-NATO contributor to the missions in Iraq. They've done lots and lots of joint training with NATO forces. NATO has a replenishment, permanent replenishment commitment to Georgia. This is a trying to be Western army, and it looks very Western until you start looking under the hood, effectively. So effectively, Georgia is in an interesting place at the moment, that we have a government that is Russia-leaning, to put it mildly, but the population is very, very pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, pro-West. Last polling done, effectively 80% of people in Georgia want to join the EU, and about 73% of people in Georgia want to join NATO. So again, there's a lot of pro-sentiment there. I just came back from Georgia a little while ago, and the whole streets full of Ukraine flags, full of lots of nasty things about Putin. It's really interesting kind of vibe there at the moment. Now let's look at our two breakaways. So Abkhazia is the one on the left-hand side, so in the west, on the coastline. That's got about 5,000 troops. Now, Abkhazian army itself is not greatly armed. I wouldn't brag about it and pretend like it's a very well-armed force, but it does have some advantages. Russia has recapitalized most of their military. It's mostly broken up over. In fact, let's go back to our maps. What would I do without my maps? Here we go. Okay, so effectively this is Georgia here. Oh, sorry, Abkhazia. And you can see here that effectively it is just a giant set of mountains right here and some coastal areas back here. Again, nothing too special about the economy here. It's very reliant on Russia, particularly for power, water, gas, everything you're going to need. And their army is pretty good mountain fighters, effectively designed between three command structures, mostly separated over here. Again, most of it's going to be supplied by the Russians. And the Russians are also doing joint forces, and that's a post-Russo-Georgian War structure that they do. Now, what that means is effectively, rather than having, what Russia would do in, let's say, an Armenia or a Tajikistan, where it's a Russian force and a Tajik force. There are Russian forces and Tajik forces, but there's also joint forces. So there's Russian and Tajiks, or Russian and Abkhaz kind of mixed in. Why they do that is it makes it much harder for Georgia or any of these guys to go declare war on them, because if they strike this mixed brigade, effectively they very quickly draw the Russians into war. Takes away any hope of having maybe I could fight the Abkhaz without having to fight the Russians. And that's why they do that. Looking at what pulling up their notes here, a couple of motor rifle brigades, some very basic air defense. In fact, they've got, some S-200s, which is not terrible. Yeah, again, they're not meant to be fighting offensive. And this is an interesting kind of conundrum that Russia does quite often with their junior partners, I guess is the polite way I'd put it, where they give them enough military strength to pretty much fight up in advance for long enough for the Russians to rock up and help, but not enough logistical capabilities, trucks, fuel supplies, everything else they need to be able to go and launch their own offensives. So it kind of limits what they can do without making them a paper house that will fall over if the Georgians do decide to effectively go for an invasion. And that's very, very evident here in South Ossetia. They're also a lot more armed with vehicles and tanks than you'd probably expect. But it's all garbage from, the late 60s. Or as Russia, or as some commanders in Ukraine would call it, cutting edge stuff. Anyway, let's move to South Ossetia. South Ossetia is a much smaller population, tiny place. Almost the entirety of South Ossetia is just mountains. In fact, let me put on something I can just sort of see it. Whoop. It's so ridiculously mountainous. It's not even funny. But we'll kind of go into the very oddness of South Ossetia. Now, everything with South Ossetia relies on the Roki Tunnel, which is this little doodad here. Now, effectively, they have to bring everything in from Vladikavkaz because the borders with Georgia are shut. And now you can effectively come across the border and from Georgia into Abkhazia. It's not as tense. But the border from Georgia to South Ossetia is much more tense. In fact, that's the kind of main invasion route. And this is the big point of South Ossetia and the Russian defense plans. It is getting over the mountains, effectively getting forces from bloody Caucasus down to South Ossetia is the painful bit. To the point where some analysts will tell you that if the Russians were not pre-positioned, it would take them a week or two to get across the Roki Tunnel. But now that the Russians are already positioned on the other side, it makes it much more difficult or much easier to sort of have a force there to hold off the Georgians and then bring more guys and supplies to the Roki Tunnel. But the big points here are sort of, you've got the Gupta Bridge, which is about here, and then you've got the Roki Tunnel. And this 4th Guards air mobile force, it's actually pretty good troops. They're quite well equipped. Could probably hold off whatever the Georgians could throw down there. And that's a joint force, which again makes it more complicated to go attack. So again, we're looking at an army. Let's look at my notes here before I speak off the top of my head. Like what the South Ossetians have in their own military, because they have the joint forces, and obviously they have the combined forces and the sort of their own forces as well. But their own forces only own 15 tanks, to give you an idea of how small a independent force they have. They own quite a few of their own soldiers, about 2,500 active, and they claim to be able to mobilize 16,000. But to be perfectly honest, if they have 16,000 guns, I'd be shocked. So again, this is a infantry-based army that is effectively a tripwire, to put it mildly. If the Georgians were to come, it would be, hey, the 4th will hold them off until everything from Russia gets there. Now, even what I've got here is effectively what is sitting in the south here, on the very southern tip of Russia, even now in Ukraine. And so again, some of the southern units have been pulled off into Ukraine because the guys that sit under the 49th Combined Arms Army, which is the guys that operate out of Vladikavkaz, are some of Russia's better troops. They're the commanders that probably had some time in the Chechen wars. They're the commanders who probably have to deal and have done more rapid response training than others, because this is an area where Putin does worry about rapid response. We just saw that attack happen in Makhachkala a little while ago. Getting there quick enough and be able to take out these gunmen, within a few, effectively less than an hour, is what these guys train to do. So you do find that the guys down in there are a little bit better than the average. So Georgia's military is getting there. Now they have got some better stuff, and it's really odd when you look at the press releases versus what is actually in their military stockpiles. We have access to, they're pretty public about their records, so we have access to what they have access to. And again, this is a NATO military. This is guys that consistently work with NATO that are still rocking mostly T-72s and T-55s, mostly BMP-1s and BMP-2s. These are Russian vehicles. Even their entire air force is still Su-25s, or the fixed-wing air force is Su-25s. So again, they have to rely on Russia for parts. It's a military that is probably the least NATO-fied of all the sort of very close NATO partners, I guess is the best way to put it. They have pretty good sort of command and control stuff, good communication systems. Their troops are, for all intents and purposes, would be quite good. They get a lot of NATO training, but the equipment itself is not great. And they don't really have a huge amount of logistics capabilities to do isolated mountain fighting. So effectively, this is one of the sort of conundrums with Georgian defense, is if you could shut off the Roki Tunnel, which is again this part here, or you could shut off the road leading from, it actually really does make it much more difficult for the Russians. You might have a shot at holding off the Russians for indefinitely or 3 weeks, or just you'd force the Russians to go right through Abkhazia. But getting out there is a pain in the ass, and holding forces out there is even more painful because all these roads are just disastrously awful gorges that are incredibly difficult to maneuver. So I've driven these roads a few times, and I could barely drive that in a hatchback, let alone trying to get an entire armored convoy through it. These are incredibly windy hairpin turns that you do 13, 14 hairpin turns just to get up and down the mountain. It's crazy difficult to get around this area. I've also spent a lot of time up here in Godori, which is right close. And again, all the roads are not designed for fast movement. And that means that effectively any military force, whether it be the Georgians heading north or the Russians heading south, is going to be really susceptible to air attacks and slow moving. and likely bunching up in convoys, because with those hairpin turns, you can't just ram through it. You really do have to, one at a time, even for a hatchback, let alone some of these old Soviet Kamaz trucks. So we are a long way past Georgia being, for lack of a better word, Russian satellite, kind of ex-Soviet state, I guess is the kind of modicum you'd put on it. But then when you look at the command structures in the military, there's so much Soviet stuff still left over. Now, again, the equipment's a one thing, but it's also the fact that the Navy, for instance, sits under the Coast Guard, which is a quite common thing to do with Soviet, countries, not a common thing to do with NATO stuff. The Air Force tends to be a lot of sort of old Soviet helicopters and not designed for long reach or long range stuff, which is, again, very common for sort of your Central Asians, your Caucasus guys. And your command structure is divided geographically east-west, mostly almost built around the train lines, which, again, very Soviet, and that's all stuff that Georgia tends to do still. They're culturally very, very West, but military-wise, I would be shocked if a lot of their manuals aren't copy-paste from 20, 30 years ago. So let's get back to the presentation. So South Ossetia is getting about 2,500, but just in the Russian 58th is 65,000. The Russians absolutely outnumber them. That's just with what the Russians kind of keep there in the very south. Again, how many troops in the region really doesn't actually matter that much. It's getting them through the tunnel, getting them across the Caucasus, getting them into the battlefield. That's the really difficult bit. Yeah, and we'll go through, the Russians managed to, really whack the Georgians in the war, and we'll go through why, because, on the surface, if you weren't looking at it, it looked like the Russians did really well, and if you really start to dig under the sheets, you start to see problems. So we talked about deployments. Again, I'm just going to quickly run through a bit of symbology for anyone who isn't as depressed as I am. So with symbology, effectively, this is what the item is. So you got obviously the country. So this is obviously an Abkhaz unit. That's a motor rifle unit, and that is the size of the unit. So we got 1X is a brigade. This is a battalion. So it's effectively, again, not hard and fast, but just as a rule of thumb, 3 battalions make a regiment, 3 regiments make a brigade, yada, yada, yada. We just kind of go up and down. That's a South Ossetian unit, and that is a airborne VDV unit for a Russian, and it's a regiment. So 3 is bigger than 2, X is bigger than 3. We won't go any bigger than that. So again, that just gives you an idea on what you're looking at if you have any confusion. So I've been through that. Let's go through, effectively, I think, the march to war, because I think there's so much, misinformation is not the right word, but just misunderstanding on how the Georgians ended up at war with the Russians, because it's very different to Ukraine. It's not this completely one-sided, and there's just so much different factors that got us into this problem. So the Russo-Georgian War was absolutely massive for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the big ones was it really was Russia's kind of re-emergence as a military power. We're talking 2008 here. Russia has watched the Soviet Union collapse. The Russians have really had their military just gutted. They didn't try and rebuild things. And we come out of the 90s with Russia barely able to get past Grozny. We're now coming into the 2000s. Putin is in he just finished his second term by the time the Russo-Georgian War kicks off. But we are seeing a Russian military starting to get back on its feet. And the build-up is not quite the same as Ukraine. And again, I'm not here to defend the country. I'm here to just kind of lay out how we got here. So this man here, for anyone who knows who he is the most divisive person in the entire goddamned world. There is a game you can play in Georgia that is ask a cab driver what he thinks of Mikhail Saakashvili and time how long it takes before you get a chance to speak again. Everyone either loves Saakashvili or hates Saakashvili. There is no middle ground. He is the most divisive person in all of Georgian politics. So, Saakashvili comes to power in 2003 and effectively takes over from Evgeny Shevardnadze, who Shevardnadze is, he came to power on an anti-corruption message, but he, became corrupt. It's very classic for this region. He was a lot closer with Moscow than what Moscow probably. The best way to put that. I've just got more comments coming in. So, Western coverage of the Russo-Georgian War was very simplistic and jingoistic. Saakashvili on CNN telling one side of the story, very much so. We're going to go through all that. So, Rose Revolution happens. It's another one of these color revolutions. Saakashvili comes to power. He is staunchly pro-West. He wants to put the country to the EU. The country even rewrites the constitution to the point where Article 78 effectively demands that any Georgian government must pursue a membership with NATO or that is written into the Georgian constitution already. Saakashvili, he was going to move the country to the west no matter what. And he really wanted to bring it there as hard and fast as he possibly could. Again, probably the right thing to do. It's a different time in 2003. 2004, we watch NATO expand. We watch Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all join NATO. This was a massive expansion of NATO's boundaries, and Russia didn't respond. Georgia looked at that and went, why can't we expand? And we want to join NATO as well. That's the way forward. And again, this is also a point where NATO's relations with Russia really start to sour. I mean, I would argue that they were somewhat cordial coming into the very end of the 90s, particularly in the War on Terror years. And then after, again, depending on who we speak with, after the Iraq War, the relations with Russia really soured because effectively Russia tried to, work between the US and Iraq and trying to make sure this didn't happen and was, trying to be a bit better about it. And NATO just openly dismissed them. It really did sort of set a bad tone for what was going forward. So 2005, George Bush visits Georgia to the point where the main road from the airport into the city is still called George Bush Highway. And there's still a lot of people who remember it. There's still a lot of people who speak very positively of it. It was a big moment. It's the first US president to ever visit Georgia. Is there really 65,000 Russian troops in North Ossetia ready to go? No, that'd be 65,000 troops across the entire 58th Combined Arms Army. So, that would be personnel as well. So again, I also think there's a big thing when you talk about numbers of troops. For every person pulling the trigger and firing a gun, there's probably going to be, let's say there's 10 people, 3 of them maybe fire guns, and there's 7 people who are worrying about fuel, logistics, and keeping everyone fed and clothed. So as much as you might see big numbers of 65,000 people are here to fight, that doesn't mean there's 65,000 people here firing guns. Yeah. So Georgia, 2005, George Bush has this really close relationship with Saakashvili. Saakashvili feels like he's, on the top of the world. And he actually starts boosting defense spending up to 9 to 10% of GDP, which any Canadian in the room just panicked. So, Georgia was rearming, taking its defense seriously, and it now started asserting itself saying, we reject, so it wants South Ossetia to reabsorb back into Georgia, whether it likes it or not. Obviously, South Ossetia rejected that, so did Abkhazia. So 2006, Georgia actually starts to escalate things a little bit. Georgia orders all troops, and it orders all Russian troops to leave. So obviously, Russia rejects it. And this is the kind of, the pattern we keep seeing is Saakashvili will continue to drum up and sort of talk about, how serious things are and what we can do and what we need to do. And Russia will continuously push back or reject. So take it back a second. Georgia comes out of the sort of the rebellion, the sort of civil war almost that breaks off at the very beginning of independence. They end up in 94 jumping into the CST, which is what becomes the CSTO, Russia's version of NATO. They leave in 1999 after Russia's attack on Grozny. They don't want to be seen effectively supporting that, particularly as they've got populations of Chechens and whatnot in their country as well. And they leave in 99 with them. Azerbaijan leaves and Uzbekistan leaves as well for a whole different reason. Now we come into 2006 and they're still part of the CIS, which it's sort of a trading bloc, but they can do military partnerships. It's very weird. It still exists. They pull out a bit later, but this is the first time they start talking about leaving any of these Russian institutions they were still part of. They also just start arresting border guards. So a lot of these South Ossetia and Abkhazia will have sort of border troops that just patrol the area, and the Georgians will just start arresting them, which again just escalates tensions. So 2007, things start to quiet down a little bit. And then 2008 is when things, I'm just remembering my notes in 2006. Georgia also, for the first time, sends troops into the Kadori Valley. So if we actually see, this is the modern Georgia that we all know and love today. But if we actually go back to the borders pre-2008, this is what they look like. This was actually part of Georgia. And South Ossetia is the most border-gory nonsense you've ever seen. Let me turn to 2008. Okay, yeah, there we go. Here is what peacetime looks like. So then we can see here the border gore that it is. Now, 2006 is the very first time that Georgia will send troops into Shara, which is effectively the Kadori Valley. That's a big no-no because it was technically part of Georgia, but it was very much ethnically Abkhaz. So it doesn't feel like an escalation because it's part of Georgia, but it was a move that definitely poked the Abkhaz and how they felt about it. In that same year, so 2006, we're still talking here, Georgia starts to make efforts to arrest Abkhaz leaders and even tries this operation where it lands an Mi-8 helicopter inside Abkhazia to try and land and sort of arrest these guys and take them back out, arguing that this is all part of Georgia. An Mi-8 is shot down, though, and that effectively puts the Georgians back in the box for a year because it was obvious that the Russians were going to give anti-air equipment to the Abkhaz. So then we come into 2008, and things really start to speed up, for lack of a better word. I'm missing a slideshow. Anyway, so 2008, the big thing that happens is Kosovo gets recognition in February. That was a big step for the Georgians because the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians both requested assistance and requested recognition. They did not get it. Russia was very annoyed about the recognition of Kosovo. They'd watched the NATO intervention. They'd watched now that now NATO was going to back Kosovo and worried that maybe something like that happens in Abkhazia or South Ossetia. Again, I don't think that was the NATO plan, but it was a concern from Russia at this point. And effectively, then we end up in April at the Bucharest summit. And this is a big celebration, effectively looking at, expanding NATO, talking to new NATO states, bringing and expanding NATO. And at that summit, both Georgia and Ukraine, this is 2008 now, are promised NATO membership. They will have a path, they will have NATO membership. And this is, unfortunately, they're promised by the United States and promised without really consulting most of the NATO partners. In fact, it's Bush standing on stage saying these guys are going to get their path to NATO, yada, yada, yada. The French and the German leadership, particularly the military leaderships, all both reject that and say, no, we will not be putting Georgia into NATO. Now, obviously, the Germans, we know, much more Russia-friendly at this time. The French, really still annoyed. I mean, this is 2008, we're still very annoyed at the Americans about Iraq. Yeah, at this point, there's, depending on what rumors you want to, believe and not, Saakashvili thinks he overhears a conversation or thinks he has a conversation with Bush saying that he would defend Georgia if Georgia were ever under attack. Now, I don't know how true that is, but give it 20 seconds and every cab driver will tell you that's what Bush promised. And that's definitely a rumor that will persist through Georgian politics. So that's 2008. Then right after that summit, so that's April 2008, that's about the 3rd to the 5th memory service. On the 20th, a Georgian drone is shot down over Abkhazia by a MiG-29. Putin, who's just given up the presidency at this point, states that it was a NATO MiG-29 that shot it down, to which NATO went, not us, what are you talking about? Which showed that the Russians were just bald-faced happy to lie about this. The Russians also start responding to the Georgian troops that had assembled here in the Kaduri Valley. So start to, supply the, rebels is not the right word, but separatists with more arms. And you watch that, this tempo starts to build. In May, the rhetoric from Saakashvili just continues to flare up. And you watch Saakashvili talking more about reclaiming these areas for Georgia, pushing the Russians out by force, really going for it. And NATO doesn't really rail him in, again, because Saakashvili is a very important partner in Iraq. He's a very important partner for NATO's kind of new Eastern policies. But the big move the Russians kind of raise their eyebrows about is they rebuild all the train lines heading from Sochi down through Abkhazia, which was the biggest hint to everyone that Russia is expecting the worst. Then we come to July. So effectively, July starts with, depending on who you want to talk to, again, it's not 100% confirmed who pulled the trigger on this one, but a bomb goes off killing some Ossetian military leaders. And the Ossetians blame the Georgian intelligence. Georgian intelligence blame Ossetians for killing their own people. It's not known. So that's the 3rd. On the 7th, effectively, we watch 4 Georgian police be arrested by the South Ossetian police on the border. And you can just see this escalate, this tit for tat starts. Now, to try and calm things down, there's a wonderful I can give an entire 20-hour talks about the sort of how you use military exercises to send a message. But the US, as classic stuff does, watches it escalate on the 7th and then announces that they'll be doing military exercises in the region with the Georgians on the 15th, which is a signal to the Russians, hey, look, we are watching this. We don't want this to escalate. We don't want this to get out of hand. We're happy to support the Georgians. In turn, obviously, the Russians announced military exercise the next day with the Abkhazian and South Ossetian. So you're now watching dual military exercises kicking off inside the region at the same time. So that brings us to August 1st, and this is where things really start to escalate. So let's go back to my map. So August 1st, a Georgian police officer who's driving through near Skin Valley runs over an IED and explodes, kills 5 Georgian police officers. Georgian snipers then decide to retaliate by taking open shots at South Ossetian border troops, just the guys who patrol the border, killing a few snipers, or killing a few border patrol guys. Obviously, the South Ossetians respond by artillery striking where the snipers were shooting from, and the Georgians respond by artillery striking where the artillery is coming from. And you just watch this escalating cycle kicking off. Now, things started to calm down. It seems like the US trying to really rein the Georgians in at this point. It's the first time they've really done so, but they're not doing so really heavily. And on the second, the day after this, the military exercises end. Most of the Americans go home. The Russians send some guys home, but not everyone. And this is a really classic tip by the Russians, the Uzbeks, a bunch of these guys do it. They run a military exercise right before they want to go do any military invasion or whatever they want to do, for 2 reasons. One, it gets the troops better practiced, better understanding of what they need to be doing, which is always useful. But B, they also tend to leave a lot of equipment and communication stuff behind. So classic example, when the Uzbeks sent all those troops down to quash things in Karakorum, Pakistan, when they left all their surveillance equipment behind. So it makes it much easier to get back in there the second time. And the Russians obviously did that. The Russians also left, from memory serves. Yeah, that's about right. So the Russians, they put peacekeepers in, but they also started moving VDV paratrooper units into the north of South Ossetia and moving forces toward the sort of the Roki tunnel. They also start putting in more forces into Abkhazia as well. Again, Georgia doesn't know about this at this point, but this is trying to get past that problem of, if a well-coordinated military really knew what they were doing and they could get in and shut off the 2 roads, it makes invasion of Georgia much more difficult. So you always want to have Russians on that side of the Caucasus. Back in this day, we're talking 2008, the Russians didn't have a lot on that side of the mountain. So on the 3rd, Russian defense minister meets with the South Ossetian leaders, talks about the Georgians drumming up for war, and orders, effectively the evacuation of a good chunk of the South Ossetian population. In fact, all children were ordered to leave the area and retreat to Vladikavkaz. That's the 5th. They start leaving. At this point, we also start to see the first pushback against the Georgians. At that point, the Israelis were actually talking about selling a bunch of Merkava tanks to the Georgians. And the Israelis said, no, we don't approve of this. So we are no longer selling you tanks, which should have been a signal for the Georgians to probably stop. But yeah, it didn't stop them. At this point, NATO spokesman Carmen Romero, she comes out and says she's not aware of any troops moving into South Ossetia. Whether the US actually did know or didn't, it's still up for debate, but the US claims that they don't know that the Russians are moving into the area. So then August 6th, so we are probably 2-3 days out from the war, a Russian newspaper starts talking about openly mobilizing against the Georgians. And it's always interesting to see what Russian newspapers say what, because some are more Kremlin tied than others, and some will say things the Kremlin can't say. And you have some of the more Kremlin-aligned newspapers start to openly talk about war with Georgia, which means the Kremlin is, for lack of a better word, approving of it, but not willing to say it yet. Now, at this point, if we go back to, let's go to Skin Valley and take a bit of a closer look. Yeah, so the Georgians actually start moving additional troops, not all of these guys yet, and this is kind of, I put a few days together here because I've got so many maps, but they start moving into this area here and start shelling Ossetian positions in here. And again, this is all border gore, this is awful. On the proviso, they say that, snipers are shooting at Georgian positions. Again, that's their justification. That's what they do. Now, at this point, the British ambassador to Georgia, Dennis Keefe, who goes on after this, become the head of the mission in Moscow, and then he goes off and becomes the ambassador to Serbia from serves. He does a tour of Skin Valley and South Ossetia, is trying to calm the situation down. And unfortunately, if reports to be believed, shot at by the Georgians. And he's absolutely livid about it. So he talks about, why are you doing this? We need to calm things down. Why are you using grenade launchers into the city? Because again, the Georgians occupy all the heights pretty much around Skinbali. It's not a good position for the defenders in here at this point. So we're, late that night, so the British ambassador leaves, he blasts them on television, but about 10:30 that night, the Ossetians start bringing in large caliber weapons and start just taking random pot shots at the Russian peacekeepers based in the south of Skinbali here. Again, whether Saakashvili ordered that is very different, and this is a problem that happens with the Russian system that also going to translate to Georgia as well, is you have the regular armed forces that operate under the Ministry of Defense. They are classic, what you expect an army to be. And then you usually have a border force. And this is quite often quite a large force, but they operate usually under the security services, so under the FSB kind of guys. Now, those guys are given a completely different set of rules of engagement. As while if you're in the Georgian 4th Motor Rifle Brigade, you would have to ask your commanding officer to fire on an enemy. You'd have to make everything is right up the command chain, decided what to do. The guys who are border patrol are allowed to kind of fire on anything they see because they are the first line of defense. You don't want your border patrol, when a enemy tank comes through, to be calling the commander desperately trying to find something. They're also quite often, particularly when the doctrines were written, based in areas where there wasn't good communications, there wasn't good phone lines, there wasn't good ways to report back. So these guys are given a lot more permission to just fire on things as they see them. Great, fantastic, really good for, rapid response. It also means that you quite often have cowboys in these units who will happily mortify things without looking at what the commanding officer wants. And you can already see a problem here that if you've spent 3-4 years of rhetoric talking about how the people in Skinbali are X, Y, and Z, and then they deserve it. It is not it wouldn't be out of the question to see these guys be a little bit too trigger happy. So it is difficult to know if it is Saakashvili ordering this or if it is just border guys kind of being a bit too trigger happy. In any case, throughout the night, we just see lots and lots of mortar fire between both sides. Both sides are hit, and again, but it's much worse for the South Ossetians being surrounded. But this is the first time Saakashvili will call for peace talks. And there's going to be so much of that going through, it'll be almost a running joke. So just after midnight, effectively, the South Ossetians claim that effectively the Georgians started using grenade launchers through here and through here. Whether they did, I think it's still a little bit up for debate, but we'll talk about that later. And we also start to see the first Special Forces brigades entering into South Ossetia from Russia proper. We're starting to see the big boys coming in. That's not known yet, though. By 10 a.m., the South Ossetians are firing on more villages, and for some godforsaken reason, Saakashvili now flies to Gordy, which is here. Now, Gordy's a really interesting city in Georgia. I actually have visited it. It's, when you go around Georgia, to sort of back up and say, if I go around Central Asia, I will quite often I can start a conversation in Russian because people will just understand Russian. And even they know if I say, hey, I'm not Russian, but I can speak Russian, and it's a default language. In Georgia, you don't tend to get people open conversation with you in Russian. If they see, a generic looking white guy like I am, they tend to start in English or in Georgian or whatever they can. Gordy is a very pro-Russian town, which is very odd for what we're about to go through later. It's also the birthplace of Stalin. And they're very proud of Stalin there. It is a very odd outlier to the rest of Georgia, to the point where it's the only city where everywhere people will open in Russian, which is odd. But anyway, Saakashvili will fly to the Gordy Hospital and visit some of these soldiers that had been shot at previously and make a huge fuss about it in the media, which again just ratchets up tensions in the country. Georgian Interior Minister will also report that the Ossetians are shelling villages in Georgia, which, again, both sides were guilty of at the time. And Georgia will effectively by that evening, by about 2300, open up a massive artillery strike on Skinbali in response for, what had happened earlier on that day. Now, they will also claim that they opened up with smoke grenades to tell people to leave. Again, I haven't seen one way or the other. Anyway, so at that point during the day, there was supposed to be peace talks. Saakashvili, again, is this weird situation where he is ratcheting things up on television, but whilst his parliament and while his government is effectively trying to negotiate with the Russians to cool things down. But the Russians and the South Ossetians do not arrive at the peace talks. Now, they claim to have a flat tire. I think that might be bullshit. But regardless of which, we are now watching more and more Russians storming through the Roki tunnel. We're watching Russian air assets start to refuel, start to get ready, start to move things into place. Let some of their pilots have a rest for the day so they might be ready for some more missions tomorrow. Because I think everyone knew what was coming. And then 2300, Georgia opens up a massive artillery strike on Tbilisi, and effectively the war begins. And that brings us to August 8th, which again, and I keep forgetting it until I looked back at my notes, is the day of the Beijing opening ceremony, which all the world leaders are in Beijing, including Putin in Beijing. But it's a crazy moment that the world is all focused on Beijing whilst this is all going on. The same exact day. Boggles my mind. So effectively, after this midnight strike, a course of 888, very auspicious. So after the massive artillery strike on Tbilisi, Saakashvili will go on television and he will suggest, he will state in part of the speech says, this is the beginning of a military operation to restore constitutional order, which is, that's a way to put it. And you see massive mortar barrages, get back to our Tbilisi map, massive artillery barrages right through this area here. It was unequivocal, we are heading to war. So at about 2:06, all power is cut to South Ossetia. It's not actually until a few years later that Abkhazia gets all its grid power from Russia. It actually produces a lot of it now via hydropower, but gets a lot of its stuff from Russia. So at 2:06, all the power goes out right across South Ossetia, and at 2:00, the Georgians make the big strike in, effectively surrounding, cutting the city off, and advancing right up the left and right, and then putting the fourth in to do the main work. They really struggle up here. They're just, again, they're not ready for this kind of attack, and it's all mountainous, it's all nonsense. And the Georgian hoped they could get there before the Russians could really get entrenched. And supposedly the reason that Saakashvili launched this in the middle of the night and suddenly is that he didn't know that the Russians had started coming across the Roki tunnel. And apparently he has an advisor supposedly telling him at about 5 p.m. or 7 p.m. saying, hey, we have reports that there's Russian battalions now coming through the Roki. And he goes, shit. Okay, well, if I can get there, cut off the Gupta tunnel or Gupta bridge, which is here, and I can maybe cut the tunnel, maybe I can prevent the Russians coming in and I can buy some time. Now, he gives that as the reason he does not call his Western counterparts before launching the attack. I would imagine that he was probably nervous that if he'd called them, they would have told him not to do it as well. So there's a bit of a, who do you want to believe, who do you put the blame on? But yes, he doesn't call the West, he just launches it, taking pretty big risk, to put it mildly. So Russian forces actually start coming across the Gupta Bridge. They make it here by 5:30. They're that far through. And the Russian peacekeeping force, which is right here in the south of the city, just gets decimated. They effectively just pull back, they leave, they've got nothing ready to go. It's a really bad morning for those guys. So 6 a.m., Abkhazia moves heavy weaponry in. At 6:52, so South Ossetian planes, because South Ossetia used to have an air force, starts to bomb Georgian positions. And this is an interesting point because the Americans now turn off the GPS system over the country. And this is a really interesting point because the Americans, the Russians did not have GLONASS at this point. So all of the Russians' precision targeting and all of their GPS systems now no longer work. And the Russians did not expect that. And in fact, a lot of the Russian losses in this war will be because of friendly fire. Because the planes can't navigate properly. They're having massive troubles with their guided weapons. It just becomes a nasty sort of fight because of the fact that the Americans just turn the GPSs off. Yeah, so by 7:56 in the morning, effectively, Georgian forces control almost all of Tbilisi, so they push up to about here. It's, the war's been now fighting for 2-3 hours, and the Georgians seem to be winning. We now have, at 10 a.m., Russian AC-24s start to enter we'll go back to our big map. So at 10 a.m., so we're now pretty, not far into the war, and Russia is already beginning airstrikes right across Georgia. They start striking these airfields down here near Tbilisi, not the Tbilisi airport yet, but they start striking Moreli and Varizani. They start striking Gori. They start striking the positions that the Georgians are in. Russia will dominate the air power and dominate the entire air force situation within the first 6 to 7 hours. In fact, they'll lose, it ends up being about 4 planes. Supposedly 2 were lost to friendly fire from Russian anti-aircraft batteries shooting at them. But the Georgian Air Force, again, wasn't ready and prepped and knew this mission was coming up. It seems like they weren't told that everything was going to kick ahead. And because of it, they were on the ground when the Russians came in. So by effectively midday on day one, the Georgian Air Force is gone. There's almost nothing left, which is a bit of a problem. So effectively, the Georgian army takes Skinvali by 1 p.m. The South Ossetian reinforcements from Java, because there's 2 bases in Skinvali. In fact, you know what? I will just pull it up for you. So let's take an actual look at some real maps. So the main base, there's 2 main bases in South Ossetia. This is the predominant one. This is your big Russian military base here. Effectively, this is right near that's the border. Again, you can think about the border gore. So there's one, but the big one and the one that's kept out of range is this one here in Java. This is also where a lot of the anti-aircraft materials are kept. So yeah, effectively, coming down here from Java, once they arrive, that's the main bit. And here, this is the Gupta Bridge, which if you can take the Gupta Bridge, it prevents you. You can just see how difficult this terrain is. That effectively, if you are a tiny convoy stuck on this awful road, you are just a sitting duck for anything. You might as well just make a summoning spell for Hellfire missiles at this point. Let's go back to my timeline. Okay, so 1400, the Russians, what's left of the garrison effectively ends up just being pocketed in the north. By 1520, Chechen fighters start to arrive, and that's when the battle starts to kind of change a bit. And the second wave of Russian bombers gets off the ground as well, and they start really pummeling Georgian command and control centers. You start watching a lot of the Georgian officers effectively go from being at forward planning centers to going, okay, shit, we need to pull everyone back to bunkers because we're worried that we're going to be struck. And that obviously really throws command and control into a bit of a spin for a little while. At this point, we get to 1552. So 3 in the afternoon, Georgia raises the Georgian flag over the presidential palace. So they claim Skinvali. The battle is run, and just an hour later, Russia will start its 3rd bombing run of the day, which shows you how much air assets they moved into the region. By this point, if we go back to our big map, a huge amount of Russian troops will actually deport from Novorossiysk, which is up near Crimea. Guys from the 7th Mountain, particularly, which are pretty damn good forces, they leave on ships bound for Abkhazia. Now, others will be obviously transiting via train as well. But, all these Russian forces now departing for Abkhazia is not a good sign for the Georgians. That brings us to effectively the end of day 1 of the war, where the Georgians have taken most of the city. The Russians have now moved their artillery positions north of the city, and they start really pummeling them back. In fact, a lot of Georgians will panic or simply pull back. And again, communications is what both sides have just rat shit communications the whole way. The Russians will pat themselves on the back at the end of this, but it sparks a massive amount of reforms of the Russian military because it's just so poorly run. What should have been such a pushover for the Russians actually ended up being difficult at some points. So anyway, we have end of day 1, Georgia's taken some ground, Russia's just pummeling troops into Abkhazia, and now they're really shelling the Georgian positions in South Ossetia. So let's move to August 9th. Okay, now we start to see come in the decks today. Okay, next we've got a couple of questions coming through. Actually, has anyone got any questions before I move on to August 9th? Covering a small country like Georgia with your air defense should be easier than a large country where Georgia air defense decent enough to make up for the loss of air force. Not particularly, and it's for 2 reasons. 1, the GPS being turned off didn't help, and 2, Russia targeted them. And this is the trouble that, particularly back in these days when most of these guys are using like S-125s and really dodgy older stuff, most of it is pre-positioned and it comes to, it's all stuff that can be easily targeted. And the Russians know exactly where it is and it's all out in the open. So they become the first targets. Like the very first bombing runs the Russians will do are targeting, guys like, Kutaisi's air defense and Tbilisi's air defense. So it's already stretched thin because they don't have a lot of it, and then it gets pummeled very quickly. Again, the Russians will lose planes to do it, but again, the Russians have pretty much fair game over the entire Georgian airspace by day by day one. Okay, back to timeline. So August 9th at just past midnight, the Russian Black Sea Fleet now arrives at Poti and starts shelling it. They start shelling guys in Batumi as well, and they rocked up quicker than what they probably could have if they, not known what was coming. The Senaki military base, which is this one here, is effectively destroyed by air power. The Russians just absolutely blow it to hell. At this point, all flights out of Tbilisi are cancelled, apart from flights going to Ukraine and Turkey, weirdly enough. But all flights will be cancelled very soon because people are worried the Russians are about to target the airfields. Artillery forces in Gordy effectively start being struck by Russian air power. So Gordy is about here. And Borjomi is also struck. We're now watching all of the kind of the second tier Russian command centers and logistics hubs and weapons caches all getting struck with the Russian air force power. By 9 a.m., the Georgians try for this Hail Mary and try send a bunch of special forces to, blow up the Roki tunnel. They actually are quite successful. They kill about 23 or something, Russian vehicles coming through the tunnel. They actually hurt the general in charge as well. But they don't get to the tunnel itself. And Russian special forces, actually guys that were transferred down from Moscow, weirdly enough, the 10th, throw them off. By 11:29, so we're talking mid-morning here, the situation has drastically gone wrong for the Georgians. Effectively, the airborne guys particularly really start to, kick it in the teeth. At 12:30, we see Saakashvili call martial law, and he will officially call it a war at 3 o'clock. We also watch Georgia send 10,000 reserves to Gordy. They start mobilizing people and sending them off to Gordy, which is why they're not pre-positioned. I have no idea, but sure. Which, again, it does help that, as much as it sounds awful, it does help that that excuse that maybe Saakashvili kind of accidentally stumbles into this thing rather than pre-positioning it, because he really isn't ready for it when it comes. Georgian forces will try a little counterattack at 7 o'clock and they just get absolutely repelled. Their tanks do really badly, their forces do really badly, and the second who did the western encirclement, the third who did the right, are pretty much decimated. They are effectively wiped as units. Interfax is also saying that, there's battles going on in the hills near Java, which is, again, that second base we pointed out earlier on. And weirdly enough, the Georgian Ministry of Defense comes out that night and says they've destroyed the Roki tunnel. And this was after a Turkish journalist had been through the Roki tunnel. So it also hurt the Georgians' credibility with a lot of the international press at that point, because they were just making up stuff and it just wasn't happening. Again, Russia was making up a whole bunch of stuff as well, but that was... Russia just will lie about classics of there's way too many citizens who've been killed and yada yada. The Georgians just lied about something that was so obviously provably wrong. Anyway, so that brings us to August 10th. So end of the day, the Georgians, after effectively a day of fighting, have been ejected from Skinvali. The ports are now under attack, supposedly even blockaded, depending on who you talk to. And there are troops just pummeling into Abkhazia and South Ossetia at this point. So already we are 24 hours into the war and it's really, really gone wrong. So any questions before I move to August 10th? And when Putin was in actually going, I got a couple of questions coming through. What is the governance status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia today? I'll go through that in a bit. Are they starlets? Are they starlets in Russia? Statelets. Oh, okay, kind of, yes. Not really. It's an odd system, but we'll go through that in a bit. Because we've got to talk about... I'm talking about the Russo-Georgian War from 2008 because a lot of the same problems will exist today. And it makes it a lot easier to go, hey, look, they've tried this. This is the problem. This is what you need to overcome to solve the problem. Anyway, August, and not much for the Roosevelt Doctrine. We saw it in February 2022. It was creating... How much of the Russian Force Doctrine we saw on February 22 was being created with the seat of the pants here. It looks like the Russian Force Doctrine in 2022, and I guess we'll go on a really quick tangent here, was moving on the reforms that came from Georgia. One of the massive things that came out of Georgia is the fact that they were still using very Soviet-style large formation movements and making command decisions. Like if you look at the Marines or the US military, you tend to have sergeants can do a lot of decision-making on the ground. It makes them more agile, makes them more flexible. a German soldier, or German soldiers and American soldiers quite often are, hey, you need to take this building. I don't care how you do it. But at this point, officers are still making almost all the decisions for the Russian military, and things are being decided, right down to effectively, very minute details by, headquarters, often far away from the front. Quite often what would happen is they kind of open their playbooks and they'd be told, hey, we're going to take that building, use play 4. Again, I'm kind of simplifying it here, but that's generally what the thought is. The idea from the Russians after this was that this rigidity was a problem, and they tried to move to this, tactical battalion tactical group system, effectively very much smaller units, much more power to the NCOs. It's much closer to what the Americans do, which does work for some things, except when you need to do a massed, huge movement. And that was some of the problem of the Ukrainian invasion, that rather than having these sort of dedicated Soviet rail brigades and support brigades supporting larger formations, you had all these tiny little guys that weren't really as coordinated in with one another. And that really hurt them in that bit. So again, it's finding that balance, and a lot of those decisions were made because of how badly Georgia went for them. Anyway, so August, Russian planes also start. Today, the Russian planes will start bombing into the Kadori Valley. And we see the Georgians enter the Kadori Valley. Now, this is a big move for journalists, because obviously the Russians going before this were saying, look, we are looking to repel the Georgians from these positions, that they've attacked, and they had hinted that they were not going to go into Abkhazia proper. Now, moving into the Kadori Valley is a step over the line, because technically it wasn't part of what was effectively under control by the Abkhaz after the 93 war. But it's still, it's arguably part of Abkhazia. It's not a huge jump over the line, but it is a jump over the line. It's an escalation. So Tbilisi airport's also bombed, and by this point we are now 2 days into the war, and Russia has reportedly got 6,000 troops into the country via land, and has now successfully landed another 4,000 in Ochimchire, the naval port here. So we are now watching a lot of Russians getting into Georgia. Again, the Georgian military at this point is, I think it's about 2,000 soldiers, maybe even 3. And we are now watching Russia has pumped in a further 10,000 Russians in the last 2 days, with more on the way. So that's not, Saakashvili would probably be a little bit nervous. In fact, he is so nervous that at 5 a.m. he calls for a ceasefire and is ignored. Russian warships, again, continue to keep firing on this, and our buddy, the Moskva, actually rocks up here as well. The good old Moskva. I wonder what they're up to today. If memory serves, they joined the submarine fleet. So, anyway. So, as I said, the Russian 3rd and 4th, also the Georgian 3rd and 4th brigades are effectively completely wiped from existence. And what was after fire? Well, was that after fire 9 or 10 for the Moskva? I love there's, I can't remember who posted it a while ago. It was like how to identify aircraft carriers by satellite photography. And, it gives you kind of really good tips on how to do Russian and also how to do Chinese and American ones. And then when it gets to the Russian one, it's just a big plume of smoke. And it's like, well, that's the Russians. It's on fire. Anyway, so we now arrive at 12 o'clock. Abkhazia now calls for full mobilization. Again, it's one of these things that by this point, everyone is mobilized anyway. There's 2 levels of mobilization. There's effectively getting everyone guns on, ready to go, out the door, heading towards the front. And you'll call for mobilization, to go from your 5,000 active guys and try and call up your 13,000 reserves. But those guys, honestly, won't actually be ready for battle within, probably a month. So does it actually make a difference to the war? Probably not. But it sends a signal to say that they're ready for a longer fight. They are in a state of war, that the people should be ready for war, that people should be going down that road. And again, that's a part of this kind of diplomatic signal of how you escalate things or de-escalate things using military maneuvers. Yes, so now we get to 13:30, so 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and Nicolas Sarkozy, who's the president of France at the time, effectively calls for a ceasefire plan to withdraw. Obviously, the Russians are not as keen to do that at the moment, and we watch all the diplomats working in Tbilisi all start fleeing into Armenia, because everyone knows the Russians are barreling at this point and maybe Maybe do they stop before they get to Tbilisi? No one really knows at this point. It's at about 7 p.m. The Georgian Ministry of Defense also flees, which is, again, not a great move. The aircraft manufacturing plant, this is actually a really interesting point, but 7 o'clock, the Russians hit the Georgian aircraft manufacturing stuff. That will never recover. And it's really interesting. They actually really hurt the Central Asians, because a lot of Central Asia and a lot of these kind of guys still somewhat tied to the Soviets used to get their planes repaired in Georgia. That used to be the place to go. And now it's destroyed, which effectively pushed a lot of these, particularly guys like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, to now get their airplanes repaired in Belarus. So again, long-term repercussions down the road. So about 9:30 at night, the Russians announce they've got full control of South Ossetia, and Georgian naval assets are all sunk. Effectively, most of the Georgian stuff sitting in port is sunk. The Georgian Navy takes a real big hit on this one. While this is all going on, Saakashvili will be calling into the New York Times. He'll be doing American television, and he will be openly yelling at the Americans, saying he feels betrayed, saying that he demands help from them. If I was in his position, I understand I probably would do the same, trying desperately for anything I can get. But it did not help the situation, I guess. We also see heavy strikes kicking off on Gori. And that brings us to effectively the 11th. So Gori's under attack. We're now kicking stuff in. So there you go. There is where we are at the end of the 10th. 11th. By this point, things are really getting wrong. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, the last defenders at Senaki are abandoning ship. They're running as fast as they can as Russian paratroops just start pushing into Abkhazia proper. Georgia proper. Again, another escalation, another signal to everyone that, hey, Georgia is, now in play. Lots of villages are captured, and we start seeing Porty start to get, forward units start arriving to sabotage things, start blowing up ships as they sit in port, really doing damage. The Russians are effectively hoping to make the Georgians completely unable to fight a second war by doing this. Zagdidi, which is this town here, is now occupied by the Russians. The Georgians are now retreating from Gori in an absolutely chaotic fashion. And again, this is all happening 9 hours or about 12 hours after the Ministry of Defense has been evacuated. The idea here, and I'll turn off flags to explain, they were told to pull back to this area here because there's a bit of a gap. Actually, let me turn off railways for a second. So many layers. Railways. There we go. Yeah, there's a gap in the mountains here where it is a bit easier to defend. Yeah, there's a gap in the mountains here that is a bit easier to defend than most other places. And, a lot of the Georgians start making that, decision to start pulling back and defending what is better to defend, because everyone assumes that the Russians will be taking the city very quickly. This is not a long race. So again, this is a bit of a panic moment, and Gori is about to fall. So they get talked to. Effectively, the Saakashvili now orders every Georgian to make a final stand in Meshcheta and hold to the last man, which, again, that doesn't really always work. We now also watch Senaki Air Base. It's also completely destroyed. Okay. That is August 11th. We also watched the Russians occupy this base at 11 o'clock, and it kind of goes over the dateline of daytime. But they destroy the base, just blow everything up and then leave. They don't even want to occupy it. They're just there to make sure the Georgians have even less capacity to strike back in the future. August 12th, Russia captures the rest of Gori. So we can just see things are starting to really go wrong. There's a panic. The retreat from Gori and from this entire area is just chaotic. Effectively, it is, Georgians just getting picked off as they run. The Russians now occupy the port of Porty. There's the hydroelectric plant is also occupied by the Abkhaz and will remain so. How much money did the Georgians pull from repairing aircraft? So I just had a question come through about how much money the Georgians pull from repairing aircraft. So not only is it's a good business to have, it's a skilled business to have, it's a profitable business, don't get me wrong. But even if it's not, it's very important, because when you, and this is why I really talk about procurement probably too much, is, when you do procurement or when you do repair contracts, they're multi-decade contracts quite often. if you're committing your Air Force to using MiG-29s, you're committing them to using these planes for the foreseeable future, you now need to make a good relationship with that country going forward. It is, even if Belarus does something disgusting, Uzbekistan's not going, he's going to think twice before calling out Belarus, because Belarus is the guy who repairs their aircraft. The same with Russia. Even if everyone hated them, if you're still using Russian tanks or Russian planes or Russian equipment, you're going to need to maintain some level of cordial relationship so that Russia can sell you the spare parts, the engine parts, the repair parts, the nuts and bolts that you need to actually make it work. Yes, so I've just had a comment come through. Both Georgia and Uzbekistan provided lots of repair facilities prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. Yes. The trouble was that, the lifestyle was better in Georgia, because again, Georgia opened up slightly, democratically wise. Uzbekistan went the opposite way. They opened up a little bit for a few years and then went really nasty afterwards. So most of the Russian, more wine in Georgia as well, but most of the Russian aircraft mechanics or the Russian trained aircraft mechanics all left to go work either in the West or go work in Georgia. So you watch the entire aircraft repair facilities in Georgia and Uzbekistan to just decimate within effectively 5 years. And even today, they can do nothing above the basics. Whole other topic, whole other time. Anyway, so we are August 12th at this point, and NATO ambassadors are really starting to tell the Georgians they need to accept whatever terms Russia is going to offer them. Obviously Saakashvili is not keen to do that. He wants intervention from NATO. NATO is starting to tell him no, we're not coming for you. And at this point, weirdly enough, so we're about 3 p.m, and Georgia, weirdly enough, takes the time to submit a formal request, leaving the CIS, which is effectively a trade agreement with the Russians. So you can imagine in the middle of this war, while the Russians are barreling towards Tbilisi, and they get a message from the Georgian government saying, we're not going to do any more trade deals with you. And the Russians probably raised a whole bunch of eyebrows at that point. Anyway, at this point, we also see an interesting crack in Ukrainian politics, because Ukraine is not particularly chuffed about this. And the very first time that this has happened, the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yushchenko, actually submits a formal request to Russia saying, hey, you cannot launch offensive operations on another country from Ukrainian ports, because again, this is prior to 2014, without permission of the Ukrainian government, at least 72 hours in advance. And the Russians tell them to, go. That was a big kick in the face to the Ukrainians, because it just showed them that this relationship they had, where supposedly, we're working with each other, and Sevastopol is it's a Ukrainian port, but the Russians are on a lease. It just showed the Ukrainians the Russians didn't care showed the Ukrainians that Russians did not care what they think. And it started to really sour things going forward. And I wonder how that relationship ended up in the long term. So we see at this point, Saakashvili will just keep going on TV and saying, there's going to be a ceasefire. There's a ceasefire. We're calling for a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire. And the Russians just aren't responding to that. In fact, Putin, who again, it's really weird. The war is kicking on. Medvedev is president, but Putin will be the one speaking on television saying, we will retreat when we're ready to retreat, which, woof. At that point, he also appears, the day after Beijing, he appears actually in Vladikavkaz and talking to troops and riling people up, which is interesting as well. Anyway, at that point at night, Bush actually comes on television and says humanitarian aid will be arriving. Saakashvili views this as the Americans coming to save him. It was not. It was just medicine and food and bits of other pieces. But the first US planes will arrive here at about midnight. That brings us to effectively the 14th, where Condoleezza Rice will arrive in Tbilisi and effectively just slap Saakashvili and say, look, what are you expecting? This is, this is endgame. Like, you need to, accept what the situation is on the ground. Ignoti, which is about here, is now digging trenches. They are prepared for the Russians to, come in, and they should be there in a few hours. The Russians are now about 55 kilometers away from Tbilisi at this point. After a 5-hour meeting with Condoleezza Rice, the Georgians will agree to the ceasefire on the terms the Russians have set. Russian forces will also start demolishing bridges, random bridges through this area as well. Just, again, making life harder for the Georgians post-war. The Russians will also sign the deal at about 2 p.m. at that point. And things seem to calm down a little bit, even though the Abkhazians actually don't stop advancing and they get better positions in what will end up being the kind of the borders in the end. Yeah, that brings us to the 19th, where Russia then closes the border with Azerbaijan for some reason, and we start to see Russia now talking about what the next steps in this arrangement will be. Then all the problems start coming out. So it was really about a few days later, on the 21st. The Economist, you can actually go back and read it. It's an amazing piece to read. They published an article where they were talking with Russian soldiers who were on their way to Tbilisi from Vladikavkaz, and they were complaining that they were so low on fuel and ammunition, and that quite often they were having to raid houses just to get enough food to supply them. That often some of their commanders were asked to buy fuel and buy supplies from locals in South Ossetia just to keep them going, because they couldn't supply enough coming in from Vladikavkaz just for what they had, let alone had this been a longer or a more difficult situation for them. And this is, again, when you peel back the operation, it just shows you how poorly run it was. Really interesting article. I read it a couple of days ago when I was putting this together, and I probably should find it again, link it somewhere. Anyway, August 24th, US warships finally arrive in Batumi, but again, the Georgian ports are so shallow, they actually can't get that much ashore. Anyway, August 25th, the Russians officially recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and the war comes to a close. And it was, as you can see, just an absolute debacle for all sides involved, but the Russians walked away with a pretty resounding victory. Now, the big other factor in this is the borders. So here's the pipelines. This pipeline, the green pipeline here, we'll zoom in a bit. That's the, Baku-Sipsa pipeline. It's a massive part of the Georgian economy. It had been massively important for the Abkhazia, the Azerbaijanis as well, because it allowed Azerbaijan to effectively funnel their huge now open gas fields into the Turkey and into sort of the Western markets. And now, so this is obviously the borders pre-2008. And this is what they're like now. And this is the problem, that now part of the pipeline actually goes through South Ossetia, which, the Russians love doing this kind of stuff, because what it does is make it so the pipeline will still run, but the Russians could cut it at any point. And that's terrifying for anyone reliant on that pipeline, because Russia could, even if they didn't do it officially, they could, I don't know, maybe let some separatists loose with some C4. But that was one of the big sort of outcomes of this war, is that this pipeline now sits within South Ossetia. Russia sent a huge message with this to a lot of its other states as well, that it still has the military power to intervene. And it would. And that's particularly a talk for the Ukrainians, I guess, is the best one. So let's talk a bit about today. Okay. So today, the Georgian military is a bit different. Yeah, it started to restock some of its stuff, but it still hasn't recovered to the same level of tanks or planes or, your self-propelled artillery that it has prior to the war. They got more javelins and they're better trained man to man, but this is still not a great position to be in, where, they are not nearly as powerful as they once were. So today, for instance, the Georgian military still operates T-72s, and T-72 SM-1 M1s, which are not particularly modernized T-72s. They operate T-55s as well. And as much as we laugh at T-55s, that's what the Georgians operate. On top of that, all they've got left is 5 Su-25s. It was effectively what was left in, what was probably in repairs during the Russo-Georgian War. That's not a great place to be. And we start looking at, okay, let's compare them to just the breakaways for a second. So T-72s, yep, the Georgians absolutely have more than what the breakaways have. T-55s, yeah, they got a little less, but they're T-55s. I'd be shocked if they really are that good condition anyway. But when it comes to things like IFVs, we start to see, IFVs are what you probably would use far more often than tanks, because being in the mountains here, you are, there's always going to be a trade-off of, if you put a tank in there, it's way more thirsty on fuel. And if you are burning through fuel, it's really difficult to refuel in the mountains. So you're probably actually going to lean heavier on your IFVs than you would for your... So again, for the more important things, you're probably, that's not great that between the two, with Abkhazia having 36 and South Ossetia having 52, they have 88, which is more than the Georgian 71. Artillery, again, they pretty much match the Georgians for artillery, particularly MLRS systems. And for Air Force, they outdo the Georgian Air Force. And that doesn't even include any of the Russian air fleet. These are just what the breakaways have, compared to the Georgians. So that's a bit of not a great spot for them. And then there is this guy. So to understand Georgia and where it's at the moment, you really need to understand who this lovely gentleman is. So right now the party in power is called Georgian Dream. And this man is Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is the richest man in Georgia by a long way. He's not even close. Bidzina has, he owns $5 billion, which is about a quarter of the entire Georgian GDP. He is filthy rich. He was prime minister for a year. He's pretty much head of the party, and almost at the moment, every single cabinet minister in Georgia was once an aide or had worked for Bidzina at some point in time. Like, Bidzina runs that country. Bidzina also made his money, and for anyone who came to our Putin stream where we went through kind of the oligarchs, much like those guys, he made his money in the 1990s quite a lot in Russia, buying up industries with black market money, and then capitalizing it and consolidating. This is a incredibly powerful man, and he has a lot of money still tied up in Russia. In fact, a huge part of the reason that Georgia is still looking and sort of leaning towards Russia the way it does is because of Bidzina. Because he picks everyone who goes into parliament. He runs the party, and that party runs the country. This man has more power than anyone else in the country, and this man is leaning Russia. Now, obviously, Georgia's got an election coming up in October, if memory serves. I want to say late October. That'll be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, this is why we have this. Even if the country is 80% pro-NATO, Bidzina can still chuck it the other way. Yeah, and he got rich playing both sides. And this is also part of where Georgia is at the moment. So, when you go sit in Georgian bars, I have never seen F Russia or, spray painted on so many walls throughout Tbilisi. And unless you're in a Russian bar, there's a huge hatred towards Russia and their invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, Georgia is also getting quite rich off the invasion of Ukraine. Just in 2022, they watched their imports from Russia go up by 1.8 billion and their exports go up by 652 million. They are, for Russia, acting as a middleman between them and the West. It's a good way to get banking done. And they're actually really good at doing that at the moment, even for the Middle East. So anyone who works in kind of international finance, there used to be a role that Lebanon used to be able to play. Lebanon used to be the kind of, let's say Saudi Arabia and Israel want to do they build a factory or a port or whatever the hell it is. Lebanon was so trusted that the Saudis could give the money to Lebanon, and then Lebanon would say to Israel, "Yep, I've got the money." Israel would build whatever it is. Israel would hand the keys to Lebanon, and Lebanon would hand it off to Saudi Arabia. Everyone could trust Lebanon as the middleman for banking, for finance, for deals, for everything you need. But then Lebanon fell to hell. And now that region is kind of looking for a bit of a middleman to play, neutral on everything. And Georgia quite often ends up as that middleman because Georgia has good ties with Europe. It has lower checks and balances for finance entering Europe. It has good relations with Russia. It's good relations with Central Asians. It's good relations with a lot of the Middle East. Good relations with Turkey. It's pretty inoffensive in its foreign policy. So yeah, it's getting rich off effectively being everyone's middleman because they're making a cut off all these transactions, and it's quite a large part of the Georgian economy. So, while you have the general population very, very pro-West, you do have quite a lot of the business community who are, very anti-Russia, but are not seeking to change the status quo at any point. Question coming in. I heard a Georgian recently comment that in Ukraine and Russia there are oligarchs, but Georgia has one oligarch, Ivanishvili. Yes, it's absolutely true. It's not a network. It's just Ivanishvili. He controls everything in the country. There is no one more powerful than him. In fact, just to give you some ideas, the current prime minister is a good friend of his. Was before being prime minister a man who worked for him at his construction firm. The head of the Interior Ministry is his former bodyguard. As I said, there's not a single cabinet position in Georgia that hasn't got some direct tie to Ivanishvili. It would be almost impossible to change Georgian foreign policy without changing him. Yeah. So, but what if? Let's talk. What actually happens if Georgia wants to do this? If he wakes up, he bumps his head in, getting out of bed, and decides, "Yep, let's go for the Russian invasion." Now, this is the trouble with if you can't shut off these two entrances, you can't shut the Roki Tunnel, you can't shut the military road. The Russians are going to pour through, and the Russians will decimate what the Georgians have in play at the moment. So you could make that call and think, okay, Hail Mary, let's chuck everything we have at South Ossetia. The problem we did last time was we didn't commit hard enough to South Ossetia as a strategy. Yeah, possibly you might be able to get rid of the fourth. It's a possibility. But if you do that, then you now have a whole bunch of Russians streaming in from the west. Okay, so if you just block up Gordy but try and go for the west, well, the moment Gordy gets cut, you now have your entire forces here pocketed. It's a really difficult country to defend because everything has to go through the Central Valley. And then you think about, okay, well, who would come and defend the Georgians if this happened? No one came the last time, but the world is a very different place. If we look at, the differences between Georgia and Ukraine, Georgia is so much harder to reinforce. Ukraine is incredibly lucky in the fact that they've got all these borders with NATO states, that it is, a million different border crossings, a million different places to cross. It's really easy to do so. There's less problems and there's no choke points. So it became really easy to give Ukraine all the supplies it needs. Georgia, not so much, because you have only 2 roads that effectively connect Georgia with Turkey. You do technically have a coastal road, but I wouldn't trust it. But even if it's 3, if you're assuming Russia's going to have air power dominance at the start, which is very likely, you're now just funneling every bit of supplies across 3, very, very thin gorges, which, as we kind of took a look at with the Google Earth stuff, is just target practice. So it becomes really difficult to kind of chuck the same amount of equipment in through Turkey. Armenia, yes, Armenia is getting much closer. They've even, talked about leaving the CSTO. France is doing stuff. But to move that amount of equipment, you'd need a port. You would need a port at minimum. And there's no one's going to let the Armenians do this. As well as the fact that, the Turks are making a lot of money from connections and pipelines coming through Georgia and Azerbaijan. They also have a pretty good working relationship with the Russians. I don't think they want to really escalate things if they can avoid it either. And if we look at the ports that are currently available to the Georgians, none of these guys are deep water ports. They're all very shallow, and that means you now need to have either 2-3 times as many ships coming in. Not a good idea, or you're not going to get enough equipment in. And even if you can get enough equipment in, if they've cut Gordy, well, you can't get to Tbilisi anyway. This becomes a real nightmare and much more difficult to reinforce for NATO if they were looking to support them. So NATO also won't allow them in, and we'll go through a bit why, but that's a problem. But if we want to go non-NATO partners, the only 2 I can sort of credibly see that I could go, yeah, I'd happily play that war game out because I think it's an option, are the Azeris. And again, I don't think the Azeris would. I think, frankly, they're making way too much money repackaging Russian oil, and they also really just don't want to see a war. I think they would, kick up a big fuss, and they call for Russia to pull out, and they call for peace. But I also can't see them, willing to fight and fire at the Russians, even though their army is very capable these days. The Armenians, they don't have an army to go defend them themselves. And in fact, as we can go through, actually we'll go through this now, it also has the risk of the worst case scenario. So where's my worst case? Okay, that's the worst case scenario. Then if Georgia was to launch a second disastrous war, that technically it could be balkanized even more. South Ossetia, depending on if you want to speak to a nationalist or not, will say that they technically have claim to all this. If you wanted to really absolutely, decimate what Georgia has, you could take Gordy, which means there's no connection now between East and West. This area here is actually quite a lot of ethnic Armenians. And, particularly guys like Dugin have given speeches on multiple occasions saying that it should be given to the Armenians. Again, I think the Armenians living in here are very integrated in Georgia. They live a better lifestyle in Georgia. They're, having met a lot of these guys, I would view them as Georgians, but a nationalist could make that case, and it would be much easier for Russia to justify it being given to Armenia because it would just destroy, the Georgian economy rather than, trying to annex it themselves. Arjun, this area here, actually only extends up to about halfway. These guys are technically probably a little more Turkish than they are Georgian. Again, it depends on who you want to speak with. They're all very Georgian these days. But you could make the argument that should also be broken away because they were almost given the same level of autonomy status as South Ossetia and Abkhazia were. So you could, under a worst case, if they were to launch another attack and it goes as badly as it did last time, which is the most likely scenario, even now during the war in Ukraine, all the forces I have here are what is not deployed into Ukraine. So there's still more than enough here to really do some damage to the Georgians. They could be balkanized further. Again, this is the worst case. I don't ever think this would happen, but it definitely would make any Georgian officer think twice before, trying to pursue that path of, trying to get back the old territories, which is why it's not seriously considered by, most Georgian policymakers. The other one, and the big one, is the danger point between NATO membership and looking to join NATO. And this is the real conundrum for someone like Georgia, where if they were to say, okay, we want to join NATO tomorrow, and they announce it and they really make a concerted push to do so, that would be the time that Russia would escalate things. And now you have a choice of either, let's say you know that Russia's going to try and invade and get you in the interim. That's what they tend to want to do. Okay, well, I'm going to say that where the borders sit today, that's where the border is. No more, no less. We're happy to, we're willing to give up South Ossetia and Abkhazia if it means we join NATO. That's a thought. But then the Russians just move the border. And the border is, particularly in South Ossetia, is really fluid. It's fencing. In fact, there's multiple stories and multiple reports of effectively the border fence between the two, just in South Ossetia Valley, gets moved. Quite often you just run through the middle of old farmers' properties, and the reports go that apparently a Russian soldier will leave some vodka on the doorstep of the Russian farmer, let him get drunk, and they will pick up the fence and move it 6 feet further into Georgia. Just like that. Because they know that the border then becomes so fluid that even if Georgia was to try and file the paperwork on Monday saying, we are giving up everything in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the Russians move the border, a K further into Georgia, and now we either have to restart the paperwork again, or, do we allow another province to go? And it just becomes a real problem. So if Georgia was to go look at joining NATO, they'd either need to do it incredibly quickly, hoping the Russians don't respond, or it does open up problems for the Georgians. And that's really the conundrum they're in. That, you have the economics guys saying, look, we're making money by being friendly with everyone. We don't really benefit from this. You have the defense guys saying, look, the Russians are already over the Caucasus. It's really difficult to eject them now. The only hope they ever had was being able to move fast enough to shut the Roki tunnels. That option is now gone. And your NATO-ish guys, even if you can get Hungary and Turkey and a few other guys to say yes, which again, I think that's a massive question. And NATO doesn't tend to do border, guys with border, what's the word I'm looking for? Border disputes when they let them into NATO. So you'd have to solve that. There's just too many obstacles for these guys to join. They will still be incredibly close partners. They'll still get a lot of funding and support from NATO, but I would not see them as a NATO member state anytime soon. Because they can't solve these issues. Militarily, they don't have the strength. And the trouble is that even if they had a really decent army, if let's say they really went back to that spending at 10% of GDP, the geography makes it so difficult because all Russia has to do is make sure that train line is cut and you've got your army split in half. And if your army in the west is now split from the east, well, great. All you now need to do is take out ports and take out caches, and you can just slowly wade them out. And it just becomes really difficult. And it would force a lot of commanders to effectively decide between defending the east or defending the west. It's one of the most defendable countries, in the fact that if Georgia had control over all the mountains, if Georgia had, complete control of its own borders, then yes, it would be a very, very defendable country. The trouble is that it just doesn't. And because it doesn't, it's almost impossible to defend. So, final thoughts. Again, we are going to see this thing, people versus politics, that while the country continues to move to the west, while the country continues to, get cozy, continues to dig in and continue to work with NATO, that may not be where the politics goes for either oligarchic reasons or just frankly because the country doesn't really benefit that change much of its status. It's going to have a lot of difficulties in entering NATO. It's also going to see an increased importance. And as more and more gas comes online from Azerbaijan, and if I hate using the word the middle corridor ever kicks off, again, I can give a nice 3-hour talk about why I don't think it will. If that does kick off, Georgia just becomes even more important as the linchpin in the pipelines. But the danger for them will always be in that, period between announcing they want to go for NATO and officially joining NATO. Because in that danger period, Russia has every incentive to either move the border slightly or go for the whole hog. And I said right now, while they're busy in Ukraine, probably not. But if push comes to shove, it's a lot easier for Russia to go mobilize some better units from Moscow to go do some of the fighting. If Russia came under attack, and that's what they did find easier in 2008, is what they did come under attack, they could actually put some of their more politically sensitive units in. The guys from Moscow, Petersburg, who if they die, they're dying in defending Russia rather than dying for fighting in Ukraine, which is not as politically popular as if the Russians had come under attack. Anyway, absolute pleasure. Thanks, Vian, for jumping in.